countless individuals find themselves caught in a profound internal struggle. The constant barrage of stressors, whether from work pressures, complicated interpersonal relationships, or the relentless tide of social and political upheavals, exerts a heavy toll on the psyche. Faced with these overwhelming emotional storms, many seek refuge by adopting a strategy of emotional withdrawal. They erect invisible walls around their hearts, striving to become cold, distant, and seemingly untouchable. The rationale behind this defense is simple yet tragic. To avoid suffering, it seems necessary to shut down emotional sensitivity altogether. This tendency to embrace emotional coldness as a shield is deeply ingrained in contemporary culture. Phrases like, "I can't afford to show weakness," or "feeling too much only leads to pain," are commonly repeated mantras, echoing in workplaces, families, and even among close friends. Such expressions do not just reflect momentary feelings, they have become a pervasive belief system, a social script telling us that vulnerability equates to frailty, and that strength is synonymous with emotional detachment. But how accurate is this belief? Is emotional numbness really the ultimate protection against the hardships of life, or is it simply a costly illusion? The pioneering psychologist Carl Jung offers a radically different perspective, one that challenges this conventional wisdom. According to Jung, the true foundation of emotional resilience, the ability to remain unshakable in the face of adversity, does not stem from coldness or emotional avoidance. Instead, it arises from a profound psychological process, the conscious integration of our internal contradictions. Jung's insight rests on the understanding that human beings are not simple creatures who can only exist at one extreme or the other. Rather, within each of us, multiple opposing forces coexist simultaneously: joy and sorrow, love and anger, closeness and distance, courage and fear. When we attempt to deny or suppress one side of these polarities, our psyche suffers. The rigid walls we build to keep pain out ultimately isolate us not only from hurt, but also from warmth, connection, and joy. One of Jung's most important contributions is the concept of the transcendent function, a psychological mechanism that allows us to hold seemingly irreconcilable opposites in tension without collapsing under their weight. Rather than forcing a simplistic choice between vulnerability and hardness, this function enables us to embrace complexity, to live in the paradox. It is not a compromise or a middle ground, but a creative process through which a new psychological reality emerges, one that transcends and transforms the conflict between opposites. Unfortunately, the majority of people remain trapped in what Jung calls the ego logic. The ego, being the conscious center of identity, seeks safety by erecting increasingly higher and thicker walls. These walls act as barriers against discomfort, ambiguity, and emotional pain. However, this defensive posture is double-edged. While it may temporarily reduce immediate suffering, it produces a dangerous side effect: an ever-deepening sense of isolation and emptiness. The ego's desperate attempts to shield itself paradoxically leave the individual more vulnerable, cut off not only from external harm, but also from their own inner richness. Moreover, Jung emphasizes that what is repressed or denied in the unconscious mind never truly disappears. Instead, it returns in distorted forms, whether through sudden emotional outbursts, unexplained physical symptoms, or even existential crises. This means that the avoidance strategy of emotional coldness is ultimately self-defeating. The more we try to push away what is painful, the more that pain returns to haunt us, often in ways that are even more disruptive. So, is it truly possible to be emotionally untouchable without becoming cold and distant? Jung's answer is a cautious but affirmative one. Achieving such emotional invulnerability requires not only courage and discipline, but a deep, ongoing commitment to a process he termed individuation. This lifelong journey involves becoming aware of and integrating all parts of the self, including the shadow, the dark and rejected aspects of our psyche. True strength, in Jung's view, does not come from rigidity or denial. It emerges from flexibility and openness, the ability to dance with one's own shadows while preserving one's humanity and warmth. The truly untouchable person is not an emotionless fortress, but someone who has learned to be at home with their inner contradictions, who can experience pain without being overwhelmed by it, and who can maintain connection without losing boundaries. In this exploration, we will delve deeply into how the transcendent function operates in real life. Through Jung's lens, we will uncover practical insights into how one might remain emotionally protected without resorting to coldness or isolation. We will examine the complex dynamics between the ego and the self, learn the art of holding the tension between conflicting emotions, and discover how the alchemical process of the psyche transforms suffering into psychological gold. This is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a guide for those navigating toxic environments, facing rejection, betrayal, or harsh criticism, without sacrificing their essential humanity. The silent question at the heart of many lives is simple yet profound. How can I shield myself from the pains of the world without becoming cold and distant? By the end of this journey, it is our hope that the answer will not only resonate intellectually, but serve as a transformative invitation to embody a new way of being, one that is both resilient and tender, strong yet sensitive. To contextualize this further, it is important to recognize how the prevailing cultural narratives contribute to this dilemma. Modern society often elevates ideals of independence, self-sufficiency, and emotional control. From a young age, individuals are socialized to suppress vulnerability, as if showing emotion were a liability. Parents, teachers, media, and peer groups alike may reinforce the notion that real strength means not letting others see your pain. Popular culture, in particular, perpetuates this myth through depictions of invincible heroes and heroines, figures who never falter, never cry, and never reveal doubt. These characters are admired precisely because they appear untouchable. But beneath their polished facades lies a deep cost, a denial of genuine humanity, a sacrifice of emotional authenticity for the sake of protection. Jung warned that this hardened ego defense system eventually isolates the person not only from external pain, but from the full spectrum of life itself. The very walls meant to keep suffering out also block warmth, joy, and meaningful connection. The price of such coldness is loneliness, superficial relationships, and an existential emptiness that can be deeply alienating. Though such defensive behaviors might be functional in moments of crisis, helping an individual to temporarily suppress overwhelming feelings, they become unsustainable if maintained over time. Living in a chronic state of emotional containment is akin to tensing every muscle in the body without allowing relaxation. The cost is cumulative, often manifesting as anxiety, insomnia, unexplained physical ailments, or emotional outbursts. Countless patients studied by Jung displayed this pattern, outwardly strong and armored, yet internally fragmented and vulnerable. The psyche, which resists imbalance, rebels when important feelings are denied, pushing them back to consciousness in disruptive ways. In addition to these psychological costs, emotional coldness ironically increases vulnerability. When cut off from one's own feelings, the ability to perceive subtle emotional cues in others diminishes. Intuition, empathy, and emotional wisdom, key tools for navigating social complexities, are dulled. This makes one more susceptible to manipulation, precisely because emotional numbness disconnects from instinctual protective mechanisms. Furthermore, emotional rigidity limits growth. Painful experiences, while difficult, often carry lessons about boundaries, values, and strength. By closing off to pain, one risks stagnation, becoming rigid and unable to adapt to life's inevitable challenges. Jung saw such rigidity as an obstacle to individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person. Given these profound insights, the essential question emerges: if emotional coldness is not the path to invulnerability, then what is? How can one protect the heart without transforming it into a fortress of ice? This question leads us to the heart of Jung's revolutionary idea, the transcendent function, the only genuine way to become emotionally untouchable without losing warmth and humanity. At the core of Carl Jung's analytical psychology lies a concept both profound and elusive to many outside specialized circles: the transcendent function. For those yearning to achieve emotional invulnerability without succumbing to coldness or isolation, understanding this principle is absolutely vital. Jung's extensive clinical studies and reflections over decades led him to a pivotal realization: the human psyche cannot thrive when it functions solely at extremes. It is within the dynamic interplay of opposing forces, love and hate, courage and fear, compassion and indifference, connection and withdrawal, that the full complexity of human experience unfolds. According to Jung, psychological suffering often stems not from the existence of these opposites themselves, but from the ego's desperate and futile attempts to deny or repress one side in favor of the other. The ego, which Jung describes as the conscious center of identity, naturally seeks simplicity and control. It prefers clear-cut distinctions. Either you are vulnerable or protected, either you trust or you guard, either you forgive or you sever ties. This black and white mindset offers temporary comfort, a sense of certainty amidst life's chaos. But it is a double-edged sword. The ego's refusal to tolerate ambiguity and conflict within itself leads to fragmentation and internal tension. This is precisely where the transcendent function enters as a transformative psychological process. Rather than forcing a person to choose between conflicting feelings or attitudes, it provides a mechanism to hold these contradictions simultaneously, generating a new, higher synthesis. This synthesis transcends the original opposites. It does not dilute them or compromise by settling halfway between them. Instead, it creates a novel psychological reality that integrates and transforms the tension between poles into something creative and life-affirming. For example, consider the complex experience of loving another deeply while also needing to establish firm boundaries. The ego typically demands an either-or solution. Either surrender yourself fully and risk vulnerability, or protect yourself by erecting barriers. The transcendent function allows one to inhabit a psychological space where love and boundary setting coexist naturally without guilt or self-conflict. This, holding the tension, opens a path to emotional maturity and resilience. Another poignant illustration lies in the aftermath of betrayal. The ego, craving certainty, often rushes to extremes, to forgive and forget entirely, or to sever all ties abruptly. But true psychological growth lies in sustaining the pain, the legitimate hurt, without denying or repressing it. This painful tension, when consciously endured, can be alchemized into deeper understanding about oneself, one's values, and the nature of trust. The pain becomes a catalyst for inner growth rather than an unbearable burden. It is crucial to emphasize that the transcendent function is not merely an intellectual exercise or rational insight. It engages the full spectrum of human experience: emotions, imagination, dreams, symbols. Jung highlighted the importance of symbolic imagery and unconscious processes in enabling this synthesis. Often, the new understanding or resolution emerges spontaneously through dreams, artistic expression, or sudden insights, realities beyond the grasp of purely logical thinking. Jung famously likened this psychological process to the ancient art of alchemy practiced in medieval Europe. Alchemists sought to transform base metals like lead into pure gold, a metaphor for the transformation of the human soul. Just as alchemy united opposing elements like sun and moon, masculine and feminine, fire and water, the transcendent function unites opposing psychic contents, producing psychological gold, wisdom, balance, and wholeness. Understanding the transcendent function offers a new lens through which to view emotional resilience. It dismantles the myth that strength requires emotional shutdown and reveals instead that authentic strength resides in flexibility, the ability to embrace complexity, contradiction, and uncertainty. Yet, despite its transformative power, mastering the transcendent function is no simple feat. It requires cultivating a capacity to hold the tension, to stay present with uncomfortable, ambivalent feelings without rushing to resolution or denial. This skill demands courage, patience, and sustained psychological discipline. To hold the tension means acknowledging that it is natural to feel anger and love simultaneously, to desire both closeness and distance, to experience hurt while still being capable of compassion. It means resisting the ego's urge for quick fixes and embracing ambiguity as a space ripe with transformative potential. But why is holding this tension so difficult? Because it calls us to dwell in an internal conflict zone where clarity dissolves and uncertainty reigns. The ego craves certainty. It wants a definitive answer, a simple choice. But the deep psyche operates on a different rhythm, one that often unfolds gradually through symbolic images, dreams, and intuitive insights. Jung compared this process to the alchemical operation of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. Old forms must be broken down, dissolved in the heat of inner conflict, before new, more integrated structures can coagulate and emerge. This metaphor captures the painful yet creative tension at the heart of psychological transformation. Practically speaking, learning to hold the tension involves developing emotional awareness and tolerance. It means sitting with discomfort rather than fleeing or numbing it. It also means cultivating self-compassion and mindfulness, creating an internal environment where ambivalence can be explored safely. To illustrate, imagine facing harsh criticism. The ego might react defensively, either by lashing out or retreating into self-doubt and despair. But the ability to hold the tension allows one to pause, reflect, and ask, is there truth here? Or is this criticism more about the other person's issues than my own? This reflective space enables a balanced response rather than a reactive one. Similarly, when grappling with betrayal, rather than rushing to forgive superficially or sever all ties, one learns to sustain the pain, explore its meaning, and transform it into greater self-awareness and emotional resilience. Importantly, this process does not eliminate pain. Rather, it changes the relationship with pain. Pain becomes meaningful rather than crushing. It becomes a teacher and an ally in the journey toward wholeness. However, developing this capacity is not an overnight achievement. It is a lifelong path that involves moments of setback, confusion, and discomfort. The ego's impatience may tempt one to abandon the process and retreat to old patterns of denial or avoidance. Yet, the rewards are profound. Those who cultivate the transcendent function experience a form of inner security and emotional balance that no external defense can provide. They become emotionally untouchable, not by hardening their hearts, but by deeply knowing and integrating their full selves. In this way, Jung's transcendent function offers a revolutionary alternative to the cultural script that equates strength with coldness. It invites us to embrace vulnerability and complexity as sources of power rather than weakness. As we continue this exploration, we will further unpack how the tension between ego and self plays a crucial role in this process, and how learning to hold contradictory emotions without fracturing is the pathway to true emotional invulnerability. We will also examine practical strategies to cultivate this capacity in daily life, helping us navigate relationships, challenges, and personal growth with greater ease and grace. Understanding and embodying the transcendent function is not merely an academic pursuit. It is a vital skill for anyone seeking to remain connected, compassionate, and resilient in a world that often pressures us to shut down or hide. Within the rich and intricate landscape of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, perhaps no relationship is more critical and yet more misunderstood than the dynamic interplay between the ego and the self. This silent yet powerful conflict underlies much of human suffering, decision-making, and existential struggle. Understanding this relationship is essential for anyone seeking true emotional invulnerability without the pitfalls of coldness or emotional shutdown. To begin, the ego in Jungian thought represents the conscious center of identity, the I that we recognize as ourselves. It is the seat of awareness, will, and social persona. The ego shapes our opinions, tastes, fears, and aspirations. It is essential for navigating the external world, making decisions, setting boundaries, and protecting us from immediate dangers. Without a functioning ego, survival in society would be impossible. However, the ego is inherently limited and partial. It operates with a constrained perspective, often rigid and binary in its judgments, good or bad, right or wrong, vulnerable or protected. Crucially, the ego mistakenly believes it can control all aspects of the self and guarantee absolute security from emotional pain. This illusion of self-sufficiency is one of the central delusions Jung sought to reveal. In contrast, the self is a far more encompassing and profound concept. Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche, the center and circumference that includes both conscious and unconscious realms. The self represents wholeness, the unified totality of the person, including aspects not yet known or integrated into conscious awareness. It is the source of balance, meaning, and existential purpose. Where the ego is focused outward, engaged in social adaptation and control, the self is oriented inward and toward the totality of human experience. The self is both the axis around which the psyche revolves and the space that contains contradictions and tensions without breaking apart. Jung asserted that true emotional protection and resilience come not from the ego's defenses, but from alignment with the self. When a person is connected to the self, they possess an internal security far stronger and more flexible than any ego-constructed wall. This internal grounding allows individuals to face rejection, criticism, and betrayal without fracturing or closing off emotionally. Importantly, this does not mean the absence of pain or vulnerability. Those aligned with the self still feel deeply. What changes is their relationship to pain. It no longer shatters their identity or triggers defensive withdrawal. Instead, there is a profound sense of completeness, a knowing that they are more than any single experience or emotion. One of Jung's profound insights was recognizing that the ego's attempts to protect itself through rigid control paradoxically increase vulnerability. When the ego isolates itself, it fragments the psyche and cuts off access to the deeper wisdom of the self. This disconnection results in tension, anxiety, and ultimately a fragile sense of identity prone to collapse under stress. Many people live in this fragile state, tense, distrusting, isolated, perpetually bracing for emotional attack. Their ego is in constant conflict, projecting internal fears and wounds outward onto the world. This internal war breeds exhaustion and bitterness, leaving them emotionally depleted and disconnected. Conversely, when a person cultivates connection with the self, they no longer need to wage war. The self does not fight. It offers an abiding protection that stems from wholeness and integration. Jung famously described the self as both the center and the circumference, the fixed point around which everything revolves, but also the space that holds all parts. Living in alignment with the self means embracing contradictions rather than denying them. It means recognizing one's shadows, the painful, difficult, or socially unacceptable aspects of the psyche, as legitimate and integral parts of one's being. It means trusting in the possibility of integration rather than fragmentation. This integration manifests as emotional resilience that is not cold or hard, but warm, flexible, and deeply rooted. People who embody this presence often appear untouchable, precisely because they're fully human. They feel their pain, but are not defined or overwhelmed by it. They love intensely, yet maintain their boundaries without cruelty or detachment. Such individuals demonstrate that true strength arises not from defense or suppression, but from intimate connection with the self. Their firmness is infused with compassion, their distance with empathy. They have learned to dance with their shadows without losing their light. However, connecting to the self is no easy task. It is not a switch one flips or a goal to be quickly achieved. Rather, it is an ongoing process that requires facing deep internal tensions without rushing toward easy answers. It demands psychological maturity and courage. This leads us to one of Jung's most challenging yet vital teachings, the art of holding the tension. This concept refers to the ability to sustain contradictory emotions, anger and love, closeness and distance, hurt and compassion, without fracturing or retreating. Holding the tension is a prerequisite for the transcendent function to operate and for authentic transformation to occur. In practical terms, holding the tension means accepting discomfort without denial or avoidance. It requires a psychological spaciousness that allows conflicting feelings to coexist peacefully. It means resisting the ego's impulse to resolve ambiguity prematurely, thereby opening the door to genuine insight and growth. Why is this so difficult? Because humans are wired to seek certainty and security. Ambivalence feels threatening, and the ego reacts defensively to restore order. Yet, it is precisely within this uncomfortable space of ambivalence that profound healing and evolution unfold. Failing to hold the tension leads to repression or acting out, both of which perpetuate suffering. Repressed feelings fester in the unconscious, eventually manifesting as anxiety, depression, psychosomatic illness, or explosive behavior. Acting out in response to internal conflict causes external turmoil and relational damage. Holding the tension, in contrast, transforms conflict into creative energy. It allows us to integrate painful experiences, learn from them, and emerge stronger. It turns psychic lead into psychological gold. Consider again the experience of betrayal. The ego demands a swift verdict, either forgive or sever ties. But holding the tension invites us to hold the pain, feel the loss, and simultaneously maintain openness to future trust. This balanced approach fosters healing and deeper self-understanding. Or take criticism. Rather than reacting defensively or sinking into self-recrimination, the ability to hold tension allows us to discern kernels of truth while remaining grounded and calm. We can differentiate between constructive feedback and projection, thereby responding with clarity rather than reactivity. Cultivating this capacity requires discipline, patience, and self-awareness. It often involves practices such as mindfulness, reflective journaling, therapy, or creative expression. These tools help us develop the psychological muscle needed to tolerate ambiguity and complexity. Ultimately, the tension between ego and self is a lifelong dance. The ego remains necessary for daily functioning and social navigation, but it must learn humility and openness to the larger, wiser self. This balance enables us to face life's inevitable pains without becoming hardened or closed off. In the next section, we will explore how to translate these profound psychological principles into everyday practice. How can we nurture the transcendent function and the art of holding tension in our relationships, workplaces, and personal challenges? How can we cultivate transparent shielding, a form of emotional resilience that protects without isolating? These practical explorations aim to guide us toward living fully human lives, marked by warmth, strength, and profound inner balance. In the final act of our exploration into Jungian psychology, we arrive at one of its most profound and mysterious concepts, alchemical synthesis. While the earlier parts of this journey helped us understand the conflict between ego and self, the necessity of holding internal tension, and the transformative role of the transcendent function, this final stage asks a far more personal question. What do we do with pain after we've held it? Is it possible to not only survive emotional wounds, but to become wiser, kinder, and stronger because of them? Can we emerge from our darkest nights not only intact, but shining with something precious? Carl Jung believed the answer was yes, but not through avoidance, not through numbness, not even through catharsis alone. The true transformation of pain happens only through a psychic process he called the alchemical synthesis, a symbolic inner journey that converts suffering into meaning and emotional fragility into something he described as psychological gold. 1. The alchemy of the psyche, more than a metaphor. Jung was fascinated by medieval alchemy, not because of its surface-level obsession with turning lead into gold, but because he saw in alchemy a rich, symbolic language for deep psychological processes. The ancient alchemists used images, symbols, and sequences to describe transformation: fire, dissolution, purification, fusion. Jung realized these were metaphors for something internal. In Jung's words, alchemy mirrored the journey of the soul. Lead, in this metaphor, is the raw and unrefined parts of the self, our traumas, fears, unresolved desires, and suppressed emotions. Gold is not material wealth, but inner integrity, balance, and spiritual maturity. To Jung, the process of alchemical synthesis is how we move from psychic fragmentation to wholeness. And crucially, it can only begin when we choose not to bypass suffering, but to engage with it consciously. 2. Pain is not the enemy. It is the catalyst. In modern society, we are taught that emotional pain must be eliminated, escaped, or dulled. But in Jungian psychology, pain is not a failure. It is an initiation. Suffering is what cracks the hardened structures of the ego. It invites us into dialogue with parts of ourselves we would otherwise ignore. The key is that this dialogue must be conscious. Pain that is ignored or suppressed becomes toxic. It festers in the unconscious and returns as anxiety, anger, depression, or physical symptoms. But pain that is listened to, honored, and reflected upon becomes fuel for inner growth. What does this pain want me to see? This question marks the beginning of the alchemical process. 3. Symbols, dreams, and inner imagery, the language of synthesis. Jung emphasized that the ego alone cannot create transformation. Logic and reason are insufficient to digest trauma. That's why the unconscious must participate through dreams, symbols, images, and sudden insights. Often, during periods of deep emotional distress, people begin to experience vivid symbolic dreams. A wounded animal, a burning house, a storm giving way to sunlight. These images are not random. They represent the psyche's attempt to communicate. The unconscious knows what the ego resists, that transformation is possible. In Jung's clinical work, he noticed that after patients consciously worked through great suffering, their dreams would begin to feature images of reconciliation, the sun and moon united, male and female figures embracing, gold emerging from darkness. These weren't merely pretty dreams, they were signs that a deeper synthesis was underway. Opposites were being reconciled. 4. Transparent shielding, real protection without emotional armor. One of the most beautiful outcomes of this inner work is something Jung described as transparent shielding. Unlike the cold, brittle defenses of the ego, which isolate us, transparent shielding is a form of inner strength that remains soft, connected, and alive. What makes this kind of shielding transparent is that it does not block out the world. It does not require emotional walls, sarcasm, or withdrawal. Instead, it flows from deep integration. The person who has gone through the fires of their own suffering and emerged whole is no longer vulnerable in the same way. Not because they've stopped feeling, but because they know they can survive feeling. Their center cannot be shattered by external rejection or manipulation, because their sense of identity is no longer fragile or dependent on others' validation. They can say no without guilt. They can say yes without losing themselves. They can love without merging. They can grieve without collapsing. This is emotional invulnerability, but not the cold kind. This is the power of a heart that has learned to stay open in a storm. 5. Examples of alchemical synthesis in life. Let us make this tangible with 2 common examples. A. Betrayal. The ego's instinctive response to betrayal is to either shut down entirely or to lash out. But the alchemical path is different. It involves fully feeling the pain, recognizing the anger, naming the grief, and then asking, what is the deeper truth here? Maybe the betrayal forces us to acknowledge red flags we ignored. Maybe it teaches us about self-respect or our tendency to overextend. Over time, betrayal becomes not a wound that defines us, but a lesson that strengthens our discernment and deepens our trust in ourselves. This is the transformation of lead into gold. B. Harsh criticism. Criticism can be devastating, especially when it touches a core insecurity. The ego either wants to dismiss the critic or collapse in shame. But when we hold the tension, a third path emerges. Is there a truth here I needed to hear? Or is this projection? By separating the emotional reaction from the content, we begin to grow. We learn to distinguish between valuable feedback and toxic projections. The experience becomes not about the critic, but about how we relate to our own worth. Again, lead into gold. 6. The real meaning of wholeness. The alchemical process teaches that the goal is not perfection, but completeness. Wholeness includes sadness, anger, fear, confusion. It does not require the elimination of flaws, but their conscious integration. A person becomes whole not when they have no darkness, but when they are no longer afraid of it. And from this wholeness flows something rare, authentic peace. Not a peace that depends on life being easy, but a peace that comes from knowing you can meet life as it is, because you are rooted in all that you are. This is why people who have been through deep transformation often radiate calm. It is not because they haven't suffered. It's because they have made meaning from it. 7. This is a daily practice, not a final destination. Finally, it must be said, this journey is not linear. One does not become complete and then remain in a permanent state of peace. Life continues to challenge us. Old wounds resurface, new traumas arrive. But the difference is that we now have tools. We have a map. We know the terrain of the soul. We have walked the alchemical path once, and so we know we can walk it again. Each time, we descend into the underworld of our emotions. Each time, we return with new gold. That is why Jung said the path of individuation, the path to becoming who we truly are, is not a one-time event. It is a daily choice, a constant commitment to staying open, reflective, and courageous. Conclusion. Becoming untouchable without losing your humanity. And so we return to the question that has echoed through every part of this journey. How can I shield myself from the pain of the world without becoming cold and distant? Jung's answer is now clear. Not by building walls, but by building roots. Not by avoiding emotions, but by integrating them. Not by becoming invulnerable, but by becoming whole. To be untouchable is not to feel less, but to live more deeply. It is to love with clarity, to grieve with dignity, to protect without closing, to suffer and still sing. This is the gift of alchemical synthesis. This is the way of the self. And the journey, as always, begins